So, welcome everybody to the Leapfrog annual meeting. Welcome. In person for the first time in 3 years, finally. It is just such a joy to see all of you in person and have a chance to spend time with you and talk with you and hear from you, because we really are a community. Sometimes we even call ourselves a family at Leapfrog. And we work together so closely. It's so important for us to come together. So I really appreciate all of you for making the time to come and join us today. So I'm Leah Binder. I am the president and CEO of Leapfrog. And it is my pleasure to introduce an MC. We have a fabulous MC for the day. His name is Steve Burrows. And many of you may recognize his name. He made a great movie that I have recommended to every single person I ever meet, including all of you, which is called Bleed Out. It's a documentary on HBO. Steve is an award-winning actor, director, performer. He has many stories to tell. And he also has a sad story to tell, and that's the subject of his documentary, the story of his mother. She went in for a routine hip replacement, and she came out with a coma and permanent brain damage. That is the story you will hear in Bleed Out. So what Steve learned from that experience, and I'm sure he'll tell you, is that he has become a major champion of patient safety and a major part of Leapfrog. In fact, earlier this year, I'm proud to say we launched the Judy Burrows Education Institute, named for Steve's mom and the subject of the documentary. So please join me in welcoming Steve, our MC.
Leah, thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here. After 10 years of fighting to keep my mom alive in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and fighting to get her justice, my family and I, we thought we were all alone in those years, juggling chainsaws and quicksand in a medical system that did not seem to care about what had just happened to us and our family. And then a few years ago, we were lucky enough to pull this film together, which I shot on my iPhone, and HBO picked it up. And the film came out, and I got a call out of nowhere from a woman named Leah Binder, head of the Leapfrog group. I had not heard of either. And she told me all about the incredible things that Leapfrog's doing, and especially those critical hospital safety grades, which I can't tell you how much I love those. And that after seeing my mom's story, Leah thought that we could partner together to help save lives, which was the exact opposite of what I had just been through for 10 years. At that point, when Leah called me, I literally had no hope. Like, I was done. And then that call, literally, you talked me off the roof. And it was a life-affirming, life-changing moment for me. And I cannot tell you what a thrill and an honor and a privilege it is to be here with all of you today. With that, I would now like to introduce Michelle Martin, board chair, to talk about our themes and our sponsors today. Michelle is the Senior Vice President of Total Rewards Experience at Paramount. She has over 25 years of experience as a benefits leader, and she's been on the Leapfrog board since the inception of those outstanding patient safety grades, which celebrated 10 years last month. Ladies and gentlemen, Michelle Martin.
Thank you. So great to be here today. I have been, for the last 3 years, presenting on Zoom, which means I have been relying very heavily on my notes. And I never used to, right? I used to get up and just wing it all, but I'm gonna rely on my notes a little bit more today. So really great to be here. Thank you all for being here and for making Leapfrog a priority. The theme of today's meeting is right now, the urgency of patient safety, and you're really going to see that theme come to light throughout the day's events. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. We'll start with, sorry, they didn't give me the pronunciation for this one, Paramount. No, you did okay, Karen. So Paramount, obviously where I work, we're a gold sponsor for today's event. If you are not familiar, I have not moved companies. I was with CBS and Viacom merged, then they changed their name to Paramount. Most of those emails will still get to me, but it's been a lot of change over the last few years, but still the same company I'm with. I want to thank our silver sponsors, Cigna and Clean Hands, Safe Hands. Where's my, I did the jazz hands for you. I think of it every time. Over there. So thank you so much. Bronze sponsors, BioVigil, Gojo Purell, Texas Ambulatory Surgery Center, and our champions, AARP, Arrowsight, Centrac, CleanBox, which I did just put all my stuff in the little box, including my credit cards. I think I got most of them back, and they're supposed to be clean. Ecolab, Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield, Medline, Nose In, SureWash, Surfacide, HealthNet, the Ortho Forum, SC Johnson Professional, Xenex, Value Capture, and Veradyne. So thank you all so much for your sponsors. You all got the little goodie bags. There's lots of stuff in there to take a look at. I'm looking forward to going through mine. And you see Paramount is the lunch bag, so take anything with you, food. Bring it to the reception tonight. It's always nice to take it on the go. So I am also going to give another reminder to stop by and visit your sponsors. You will have those opportunities to win the gift cards that Steve mentioned. And in addition, there's M&Ms and Hershey bars, and yes, I'm still focused on food. So lots of interesting stuff out there. And now, and just to return those by 3 p.m. after the 3 p.m. break, and you have to be present to win. So I'd also like to thank and recognize the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. They're in attendance today. There we go. Thank you. Leapfrog has a large multi-payer grant from the Moore Foundation for recognizing excellence in diagnosis initiative to publicly report and recognize hospitals for preventing patient harm due to diagnostic errors. Leapfrog published a report this year outlining recommended practices for hospitals that's available through the QR on the tent cards. So you have QR codes in the table tent cards. Make sure you check those out. And so with that, we're going to get started. You'll have a chance to ask questions after each of our panels today. Leapfrog staff is on hand with mics for live questions, and you could just raise your hand and they'll come over. And then we do have some mics around the room. And we'll do our best to get as many questions in as we can. And Leah Binder is going to kick off the program with our keynote focused on today's meeting theme. So please welcome Leah to the stage. And I'm going to continue with a little introduction of Leah. I can't believe it's been so many years we've been working together. Leah is president and CEO. She is the second CEO of Leapfrog since the organization's inception in 2000. And just this week, she was named this year's Modern Healthcare 100 Most Influential People in Healthcare list, which is a nice recognition of her leadership and the Leapfrog work. When she joined us in 2008, about 1,100 hospitals voluntarily reported the Leapfrog Hospital Survey. Today, the number is almost 2,300 hospitals, as well as ASCs reporting to Leapfrog surveys. And we've launched Leapfrog Hospital Safety Grade, which brought a new level of transparency to patient safety, and as we'll see today, real change. And there's some really interesting information Leah's sharing with us on that today. Before Leapfrog, Leah spent 8 years as vice president at Franklin Community Health Network, an award-winning rural hospital network in Farmington, Maine. She previously worked as senior policy advisor for the mayor of New York City, and she started her career at the National League of Nursing, where she handled policy and communications for more than 6 years. So now I'll hand it over to Leah.
Thank you, So I am talking with you today about patient safety. Many of you are well familiar with it, but I think it's worth going over some of the statistics, particularly those we learned this year about the problem and why it is urgent. So let's start with a study that came out this year from the Office of the Inspector General. This is the office charged with oversight of HHS. And they did really a follow-up study. They pulled about 800 Medicare patient records randomly, and they looked at the errors, accidents, injuries, infections that occurred in hospital stays for these 800 Medicare beneficiaries. And what they found was that 1 in 4 people admitted to an American hospital suffered some form of harm. 1 in 4, which is an astronomical rate of harm. I had the privilege of going to Detroit earlier this year and speaking with, thanks to Brett and our regional leader in Michigan, I had the opportunity to meet some safety executives from automakers who really could not believe this number. It's so far off from anything that would be acceptable in the auto industry. And yet, these are human lives at stake. 1 in 4. And it coincides with other additional research that came out this year that continues to reinforce the fact that 250,000 or so, give or take 20,000, die from preventable errors in hospitals every year. This is the SoFi Stadium where the Super Bowl was held in '22. It really is, it would take 3 of those, a little bit more, to account for all of the lives lost in 2022. That is also an astronomical rate of harm, and it's got to be solvable. It is inconceivable that we as a country cannot manage to save these lives. The other troubling, very troubling aspect of patient safety is that people most at risk are people who are often most at risk of lots of other problems in our society. A study also came out that looked at Black patients and their experience with patient safety problems, and found that Black patients were more likely to suffer preventable injuries and infections, preventable injuries and infections in U.S. hospital by significant percentages. So you can see from the slide, for instance, post-operative sepsis. Black patients were 27% more likely to suffer from this preventable problem. They're 18% more likely to suffer from post-operative respiratory failure and 30% more likely to have a pulmonary embolism or deep vein thrombosis. Many of these complications and problems that are up on the screen are deadly. And again, they're preventable. So what happens in hospitals apparently is that for Black patients, and this study was looking at Black and white patients, but there are other studies that look at a wider range of ethnicities and backgrounds. They find similar, very troubling problems where there are preventable injuries and accidents, preventable problems in hospitals where white patients are far less likely to suffer them. We don't want anyone to suffer them, but equity is a patient safety issue, and patient safety is an equity issue. So here was another, this isn't a study, this is a commentary, but it was very important and very disturbing. It came out in February. It was co-authored by leaders, 2 leaders at CDC and 2 leaders at CMS. And they found that during the pandemic years, there was a sharp increase in patient safety problems, in particular infections, in hospitals and nursing homes and a variety of other settings. And they suggest in this article that it's time for the US healthcare system to become more resilient, so that when there's a public health emergency, and it's a when, there's always going to be, at some time in our lives, there will be public health emergencies. We need to be able to endure a public health emergency without losing lives to preventable problems. We need to be able to have health systems that can go through a public health emergency without losing patients to other things. So they talk a little bit about that, but I think that's a really important conversation for health leaders like you, many of you in the room, to really begin to understand how are we hardwiring patient safety into our operations so that we can endure the stresses of life, the stresses of history, so that we don't do this again, where we go through something like the pandemic, which admittedly was a major upheaval for hospitals in a variety of dimensions. Nonetheless, people still want to believe that when they go to the hospital, they will be cared for and their lives will be respected. And when they have a problem with patient safety, often that's a case of being ignored or overlooked. Not deliberately necessarily, usually, never deliberately probably, but to be ignored and to be overlooked is a terrible experience for a patient who is scared for their life. And we need to be able to prevent that from happening no matter what else is going on at the hospital. And that was the message from CMS and CDC. At the time, back in February, we didn't have very much data to tell us what happened during the pandemic, because it takes a long time to get the data public. But CDC and CMS do get the data early, so they were able to give us this sort of early warning sign that, yeah, there's a problem, and it happened during the pandemic. Leapfrog was able to get some understanding of the problem during the pandemic ourselves. We put out a report on patient experience during the pandemic, and thanks to hospitals that voluntarily report to our survey and to ASCs that voluntarily report to our survey, we were able to get some signs of where patient experience reports might be deteriorating during the pandemic, and that's important. There are studies that have linked certain domains of patient experience with actual outcomes related to patient safety. So with Leapfrog, we always are looking for the evidence and the proof. It's not enough to say, well, the patients said that they didn't feel comfortable reporting an error. Yes, patients say that, but does that mean that that place has more errors, or is it just that's what patients think? And that's why we look for evidence, we look for the studies, we talk to the experts to make sure that what we're reporting does link to actual outcomes, and it does. These patient experience reports done by CAHPS surveys, so-called, do link, and we did find very troubling evidence of trends across the board on every domain of patient experience that suggest that it had deteriorated significantly during the pandemic, with one exception: children's hospitals. Pediatrics did not show deterioration. And I will say also, for the ASCs in the room, I think we do have some, and I know I met one of our award-winning ASCs. They did better across the board on our patient experience surveys. So something is going well in the ASC environment as well. But fundamentally, there was deterioration for everyone during the pandemic, and there has to be a way to address it. So when we look at this huge problem of patient safety, so we've got 250,000 people dying of preventable errors, and we've got 1 in 4 people admitted to a hospital suffering a harm. I mean, would you get in your car if you thought you had a 1 in 4 chance of being harmed during the drive? None of us would. I wouldn't. So how do we get at this? We have to be able to fix this. It seems so outrageous. So the first step, of course, is we've got to diagnose the problem, and then once we know what the diagnosis is, we can start to address it. The problem, of course, with patient safety is it's not one problem. It's a bunch of different incidents. It's a bunch of different things. It's all kinds of problems that occur in different settings over and over. So how do we do it? It's an age-old dilemma of, in almost all cases with patient safety, of is the problem the system? Is the problem the way that the hospital, let's say, the hospital system functions? Or is the problem some individual who did something wrong and may have not meant to do it wrong, might be an error, or they did mean to do it, and that's a different story. But either way, is it the individual or is it the system? And if it's the system, how do you address the system? How do you fix a system? This is an age-old problem, and I want to explore that problem a little bit because that problem has come up a lot this year. And I think it's worth digging into it because we need to understand the diagnosis of the patient safety illness in our country so that we can begin to remedy it. So to do that, I'm going to tell you 3 stories of real patients. These stories all came to prominence for me this year. So one is the story of Father Florian Gall. Father Gall was admitted to the hospital with bacterial pneumonia. He also had a number of cardiac issues, including arrhythmia, just a number of issues that made his case extremely complicated. He ended up in the ICU, and he was essentially in a coma and unresponsive for about a week. His sister, Lucille Gall, visited him 12 hours a day. She was a registered nurse, so she was really watching his care. She watched everything that happened to him. And he started to recover. He actually, eventually, after a week or so, he was sitting up, he was talking, he was complaining about the food, which for her was a great sign. He was definitely getting better. And he seemed to just be getting back to his old self. His vitals were looking good, and they took him off some of his medications, including a medication called digoxin. People know that. People in hospitals probably do. But digoxin is commonly used actually in hospitals around heart arrhythmia. So they took him off that. And the following day, when Lucille was not there in the morning for some reason, and she came in later, and they sat her down and said, "I'm sorry to tell you, your brother has died." There had been a code called while she was out, and he died his heart stopped and he died. After all this recovery and all these great hopes that he was going to come home, he had died. So the hospital did some blood work to get at a cause of death, and they found that his blood contained extremely high levels of digoxin. And that was a mystery. They couldn't understand. First of all, he'd been taken off digoxin about 24 hours earlier. But maybe there was some lingering, but not at 3 times the level they would expect. But they weren't real sure, and they wanted to report it correctly, so they decided to call the Poison Control Center for the state. By the way, before I finish the story, does anybody in the room have any idea about this story? Does anybody heard this story? One person, okay. All right. 2? Oh, 4. Okay, all right. So they called poison control. The poison control official looked at the numbers and said, "You have a law enforcement issue on your hands. There's no way this amount could ever have been administered unless it was criminal behavior. And you need to look at it. You need to get law enforcement in there." And the nurse who had been investigating this said, "Well, I think my CEO won't like that." But they went forward and they investigated, and they did get law enforcement involved eventually after poison control actually pushed them on it. And what they found was that the nurse who had been caring for Father Gall, a man named Charles Cullen, had actually, ultimately they figured this out, had actually deliberately killed him with an overdose of digoxin. And they found this because there was a hero nurse named Amy Laughlin, and she was the one who was kind of a whistleblower. She figured out how law enforcement could trace this back through the medication ordering system to figure out what had happened and who had been responsible and how this worked. She did a lot of undercover investigation, but she had to do this all without the hospital knowing about it, because the hospital was really not interested in getting too involved with law enforcement. So there was a lot of barriers put up to law enforcement investigating this, and she was the one who came forward to them with information, and that ultimately was able to convict Charles Cullen, the nurse, of this homicide, other homicides, and today they believe, this happened in 2003, today they believe that this nurse was responsible for over 100 homicides in his career. As it turned out, he had, this was in New Jersey, and he had worked for a number of New Jersey hospitals, and he had worked for some hospitals in Pennsylvania. He'd been fired for many of them, but then he immediately got another job. And for many reasons, hospitals wanted to protect their risk and did not reveal what they suspected about him upon his firing. So because of the reticence of hospitals and the not wanting maybe the PR or certainly the risk of a lawsuit, they had withheld this information from the next hospital that hired him. He was hired again, where he was able to have a free field. It is, sadly, it turned out that working at a hospital was not a bad career move for a serial killer, because it was right there for him, and he could just keep doing it. So when you look at this case, and we look at this question of, is this the system, or is this the individual? Well, okay, he's a serial killer, so it must be the individual. Can a hospital really protect themselves against a serial killer? Well, it's both, isn't it? It's even with a serial killer, the system is still implicated. The system allowed him to not stop at killing one person. He killed 100 or more because there was this cover-up and this effort to not go after him, not stop him. He could get a good job in a hospital because the hospitals didn't stop him. They didn't put their patients first enough to stop this serial killer. Other things had to come first, apparently PR or risk aversion, whatever the reasons. There are no good excuses for stopping the effort to catch somebody you think is killing your most vulnerable patients. It is never putting patients first, and it is not ethical. So the system was not ethical. The systems allowed this serial killer to proliferate. Obviously, he's the number one culprit. So there still is an individual, and he deserves to go to jail, which he is still in jail. So the reason that this is front of mind, my screen has gone off. Okay. The reason this is front of mind for me is because Netflix actually has a couple of movies right now streaming that they just started streaming. One is the one on the right, The Good Nurse. It's a dramatization of part of this. And the other is a documentary that really goes through this. That's where you see Amy Loughran, and you interviews a lot of the folks involved and how this story transpired. I do recommend both, particularly the documentary I thought was quite good. There's a book by the title, The Good Nurse, which is also excellent. It came out several years ago, but it is now front and center. So the American public that might be watching Netflix may be thinking that, wow, what a scary place to go to a hospital. He got away with it for a whole variety of reasons, as I mentioned, and he was hired by a variety of facilities, and there was a lot of delay, and there was a lot of concern about PR. And all of this is well documented. It's not just my interpretation. This is what happened. And it is something that did cause laws to change and things to happen, but not enough, not enough. So let's talk about story number 2. I said I was telling 3 stories. This is my second story. I'm not going to tell the whole story because we have the expert in the story here, but this is Judy Burrows. Judy Burrows is Steve's mom and the subject of the documentary Bleed Out. She went to the hospital for a routine hip replacement surgery, a lot went wrong, but a lot of things that went wrong were preventable. For instance, she was on heparin and she was operated on. That shouldn't have happened. There were problems during the operation which were covered up. All of this is shown in the movie, beautifully and sadly, but a number of problems. And then overnight, she was in the ICU, not monitored. There was one nurse covering the entire ICU, I guess, apparently, according to the movie. There was one nurse, and that nurse was inexperienced. Overnight, and Steve came in to visit Mom in the morning, and she was unresponsive. She was in a coma. No one knew that. Steve points to a camera that was in her room and said, "Don't you have?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we have an electronic monitoring system." Well, why didn't it work? Why wasn't it turned on? Didn't you notice she fell into a coma overnight? And they said that, Steve, I still cannot even believe this, because it's such an absurd statement. But they said, because they protect patient privacy, they don't turn it on. So it was just a terrible set of events, a lot of lying, a lot of covering things up, and a lot of preventable problems. And ultimately, Judy did live quite a number of years, but she had major disabilities and brain damage and things that never should have happened, that are recounted again in this really terrific film. It's on Hulu now, too. It's terrific, and it really does show what happened. But what's really great about this film, too, is because Steve told the story so well and showed you what happened. There are undercover interviews in here. You'll see who was involved, what happened. Because of that, it's now being used in medical schools and nursing schools. And Steve's been all over the country talking to groups of providers and students about what he experienced and what that means to them. So it's now an education for all of us, and we need to take it that way. And I think it's really exciting that you've contributed to this incredibly powerful story of your mother's terrible suffering. You've contributed that to our country and to our future, and we need to make best use of that. We owe that to your family. There were many bad actors in the story, so do we blame any one of them? The doctor who operated when he shouldn't have, the anesthesiologist who apparently covered up problems during the surgery. There's lots and lots of bad actors in the story. Do we blame any one of them? Well, yeah, a little bit. You're accountable if you don't do the right thing. But I will say this, so should you blame the hospitals or the systems that allowed these people to continue to cover things up, that gave them the permission to think that this is how you act in your capacity as a physician or a nurse, that this is how you behave and it's okay with us, that the culture and the leadership of the hospitals and the health systems that Steve and his mother encountered accepted this behavior as okay. So I had this year, the reason it's come front of mind to me in 2022 is Judy died in 2019, but because of the pandemic, Steve had to postpone the celebration of life for this remarkable woman, and so finally had it this summer, and I was able to actually go. There was a trombone parade in Judy's behalf in Milwaukee, in the streets of Milwaukee. That's a picture of it, which is the best funeral procession I've ever seen. It was just so joyous, and it captured this incredible woman. I wish I had met her, but the stories that we heard of her life, and we lost, as all of us lost, just an extraordinary person. And we, as I said earlier, named the Judy Burroughs Education Institute in her honor. She was an educator. She was a teacher, and so she taught us not only as a school teacher, but she's teaching us through Bleed Out, and she's teaching us through her story what we need to do better in the future. So it is just a great honor to be able to recognize Judy and also to carry her joy and spirit and excitement. And she was a person whose laugh was incredibly infectious. And Steve has shown me movies, and I really wish I had known her, but we all now get to know her a little bit better. So here's my third story. Charlene Murphy, 75, the quintessential Southern matriarch, kind, strong, and sassy. She had a bad Christmas in 2017. She was admitted to the hospital on Christmas Eve. She was diagnosed with subdural hematoma, bleeding in the brain for the non-clinicians. But she was starting to seem like she was doing better. And they were considering moving her from the ICU to a lower level of care, to a regular floor. And ultimately, the family had reason to hope that she might be home in a few days so they could actually celebrate Christmas. So they didn't open any of their presents. So in order to be discharged from the ICU, the doctor wanted her to have a PET scan, and that was on the 27th. And since Charlene had been known to have some claustrophobia during PET scans, as do many people, they recommended that she get a sedative called Versed. So she was transferred down to radiology from the ICU by a nurse, and she was given the sedative, and the family waited in the waiting room, where they saw suddenly a code called for the room where Charlene had just gotten the sedative. She suffered cardiac arrest and ultimately died from anoxic brain injury just a few hours later. Does anyone know this story? Three of you know the story. Let's see. I'll take that poll in a minute. So here's what happened. So Versed was not on the formulary for the hospital. So when the nurse went to the automatic dispensing cabinet, which is a digitized, pretty sophisticated, it's not just a cabinet like a file cabinet for those of you who are not clinicians. It's a sophisticated piece of equipment. So when she selected VE for Versed, it didn't find it on the list. So she said, well, okay, I'll just pick the first VE on the list. So she did, and the first VE on the list was vecuronium. So vecuronium is not Versed. Versed is a controlled substance and a sedative. Vecuronium is a paralytic, very dangerous drug. Both of them are dangerous. Vecuronium is particularly dangerous. So she got the vecuronium, and it's marked paralytic in 3 places, including the top where you dispense it. Unlike Versed, it has to be mixed from powder, and it's complicated to do that. It involves saline and some work. Versed does not. And the nurse said she does remember that it was odd to her because Versed doesn't require mixing, but she did it anyway, and she mixed it up. And she gave it to Mrs. Murphy in a room in radiology that was on with no one there, and that's where Mrs. Murphy stopped breathing. There was actually no one to follow up with her stopping breathing. There was no one in the room for 30 minutes. There was a Medicare report ultimately done on this case, and it cites what happened. So what happens with vecuronium when it is administered by IV? All muscle groups are paralyzed and respiration ceases. However, full consciousness remains intact, and patients can experience intense fear when they can no longer breathe. They can also sense pain. The experience can be horrific for patients. That is what Mrs. Murphy experienced in a room by herself, steps away from her family in the waiting room of radiology. not knowing this is what their mother was going through. This is not a way to die. So this is a horrible accident, horrible error, horrible thing. You can call it lots of things. Whatever it is, it's a horrible way to die. And there were many, many problems along the way in this story. But let's start with the hospital. First of all, after this happened, the death certificate was completed inaccurately by physicians who already knew what had happened. The nurse had told them what happened, they knew what happened, they saw the vecuronium, they knew it. And they filled out the death certificate as a death by subdural hematoma, by the bleeding on the brain, and that was not accurate. They didn't report it as they were supposed to the Joint Commission or the Tennessee Department of Health. There was no documentation of any of this in the chart. The medication dispensing cart that I mentioned, the high-tech unit that the nurse used, was not optimal. So let me put it that way. It wasn't optimal. It could have been a better, there's a higher level of protection that can be afforded in these carts. So some of them, for instance, function so that you order by patient, and it dispenses what's ordered for that patient, as opposed to ordering by medication, as happened in this. Nonetheless, it still had an alert, and it is a system that is meant to prevent errors like this, and it did work to some extent. It just maybe wasn't the highest level of technology, and it should have been. And finally, a whistleblower brought this to light. It would never have come to light otherwise. The nurse did not lose her license. The death certificate did not record this correctly. None of the officials like Medicare were ever informed. The Joint Commission didn't know about it. Nothing would have happened. There was a lawsuit, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. So what about the nurse? That individual nurse, what happened there? Well, there are a number of problems cited for that individual nurse. She overrode the medication dispensing cabinet warnings. They tried not to give her that vecuronium. She overrode the warnings. She wasn't supposed to do that unless it was an emergency, which this clearly was not. She was not in a hurry, by the way. She claimed that in later investigations. She was not in a hurry. And she just overrode. She failed to examine the medication. I said it had 3 places where it warned this is paralytic and in very dangerous medication. She overrode those. She ignored them somehow. She didn't pay adequate attention to dosing. There were 10 milligrams dispensed from the cabinet of vecuronium she thought was Versed. The order was for 1. She said in later investigation she didn't really remember how much she gave. She thought she gave the whole thing. And she never recorded what she gave in the medical record either, so no one actually knows, but she clearly gave her some. She didn't record the administration, as I said, in the record. She didn't monitor the patient. Now, this is, to me, really troubling. So I showed you what happened with vecuronium, which is a terrible death. The impact of vecuronium when it is administered through an IV, as it was with Mrs. Murphy, takes place, according to an anesthesiologist that I spoke with, takes place in about 40 seconds. So it isn't like it was a subtle thing that she could have just not seen. She had to have administered this and basically turned around after administering what she thought was a controlled substance and walked away and left Mrs. Murphy by herself. But it had to have been within 30 to 40 seconds or she would have noticed. So there's also been reports that she admitted the error, and that is in the Medicare report. However, she admitted the error after another nurse found a plastic bag with vecuronium in it in a drawer, in a desk drawer, and said, "What's this? Did you give this to Mrs. Murphy?" And then she said, "Oh, yeah." Then she confessed. So the nurse, there were some very troubling aspects of the nurse's behavior. And those of you who are clinicians, I think probably would be even more understanding of just how egregious some of these violations, when you combine them all together, really are. The simple 5 rights of medication administration, the right patient, the right dose, the violations here of not recording of dangerous medication being administered to a patient, the overrides, the turning around and leaving a patient immediately after administering a controlled substance. All of those things together are really troubling. Does anyone else, no one still knows other than those we know? You know what it is? Okay. All right, so let me give you my diagnosis before I tell you more about this case. So this is a case where it is both the system and the individual. Yes, this hospital should have done more to prevent this. But they did have an okay system for preventing errors like this, and they did have some systems in place to try to prevent it. They covered it up, and they didn't report it. They didn't do a root cause analysis. So all of those things made this much worse for the family and much worse for the hospital. And much worse, of course, for all of us to even hear about it. But the hospital could have done a lot more, and they created an environment where it was possible for this nurse to do what is truly egregious and, I think, negligent acts, which even I, a non-clinician, know that some of these acts are just total disregard for the health of this unbelievably vulnerable human being. So it's the individual, but it's the institution. Why did they have her? Why is she hired? This couldn't have been the first time she demonstrated poor behavior as a nurse. It just couldn't be. Or maybe it was, but in any case, it is both. And it actually ended up in court in 2 ways. One is the hospital. The hospital had a lawsuit with the family soon after this. They settled it. We don't know, non-disclosure, we don't know what happened in the settlement, but it did get settled. And we can't hear about what happened. But there was a corrective action plan implemented with CMS. And that corrective action plan did not improve that dispensing cart. By the way, it just said you should mark the vecuronium with one more marker. And that train the nurses in the 5 rights, which, frankly, I don't think nurses need to be trained in the 5 rights. But, I mean, everybody should get training and education and support, but that wasn't the problem, that they didn't know this nurse did the wrong thing. And this hospital suffered really bad PR. I'm going to show you that in a second. The outcome for the nurse, however, was particularly bad. She was fired immediately after this. She never got back on the floor. So the hospital recognized immediately that this was a problem. And she got another job right away. So same problem I just showed you earlier with Charles, the hospitals investigated his serial killing behavior, but they didn't give him a bad reference, and off he went to the next job. She did too. Now, she was a serial killer, I'm not saying that, but the nurse who they fired for cause got another job. And she lost her license 9 months later after the whistleblower came through. She lost her license, and then she couldn't get another job. And then something else happened to her. She was prosecuted in criminal court. Her name was Redonda Vaught. Does anybody else now know what this case is? A few more of you. She was convicted of criminally negligent homicide and abuse of an impaired adult by a jury. And this is also, she was sentenced to 3 years probation. This is also known as the Vanderbilt case. Happened at Vanderbilt this year. Well, the case was resolved this year. And it was extremely upsetting to nurses. And it got a lot of attention in the healthcare community. It became what I would call the Oscar slap of healthcare. This was a big issue for the healthcare community. Because the charge was made, well, why are we taking this nurse to criminal court for making a mistake? And then the hospital gets off scot-free. But they don't really suffer many consequences at all, but she's in criminal court. And it is demoralizing. You can see that a lot of the messaging that the nurses in particular used in many of the protests on behalf of Redonda Vat were, we are all Redonda Vat. We can make this mistake, and I don't want to be thrown in jail for making a mistake. And yet, when you look at the series of mistakes, this is a little bit more than mistakes. I personally, if I were on that jury, would have voted the way they did. I think that she showed a breathtaking disregard for the well-being of her patient. And that fundamentally is one of the worst things that can happen to any patient in any hospital, is if your caregiver has a breathtaking level of disregard for your well-being. So not the errors, mistakes happen. This was that the disregard that prefaced these errors was extremely troubling. The walking away after administering a controlled substance and leaving her to die alone was just negligent behavior. That said, it was extraordinarily harmful to send a message to nurses of this country that if you make a mistake, we're going to throw you in jail. That message was very damaging to all of us because people make mistakes. These are human beings that work in hospitals. We expect them to make mistakes. We expect systems to protect us against those mistakes in some way. And yet they were disturbed, and there's reports of nurses quitting and leaving. So my 2 cents on this, but I'll be interested to hear what my panelists have to say. In this case, there was a lack of transparency and a lapse in ethics. Individuals, one individual in this case failed, and the system failed to protect us as patients from this individual. I believe that accountability must begin with the system because it can't start anywhere else. Redonda Vat has to work somewhere. She can't do what she did accidentally and negligently, however you want to define it. She couldn't have killed Mrs. Murphy if she weren't part of a system that should have prevented it somehow. And if they couldn't, they should have been in court in a public spotlight and not able to hide the results of a malpractice, so we never know what happened. They covered this up and failed in many respects to make this public so we could all learn from it and make sure it never happens again. So this was a major lapse by this system that we have to depend on as patients. We don't know every person who works in the hospital that we go to. So we have to depend on that system, that leadership, to make sure the people who work there know that this is an ethical place where patients come first. And that's how we all behave. And if you don't, you're out. So this was a lapse. And the cost to these families was terrible, but I will say, in all 3 cases, there was a problem with transparency. So with Father Gall, there was cover-up by the hospital to try not to get this public to law enforcement, trying not to get it out. It was going to look bad for the hospital. Lots of covering up. So whistleblowers and others fought to make it public, and now it is. With Mrs. Murphy, I just mentioned there's many attempts to cover this up and might have even succeeded without that whistleblower. And then, of course, with Judy Burroughs, you'll watch the movie, you'll see there were many attempts to make sure that the Burroughs family never found out what really happened. They did anyway, but it was many cover-ups. So transparency was not part of the playbook for any of these cases, and when we could finally break through and get that transparency, it gave us an opportunity to learn from these lives about what we can all do better, and that's really important to all of us. And these were also major lapses in ethics. This was bad behavior. So people think ethics is complicated, like ethical dilemmas. We all think it's difficult. Well, some things are difficult in ethics. There are dilemmas. But most things in ethics are just what's right and what's wrong, and we know that. These were wrong. Wrongs were committed. These were wrong things. And in environments where wrong things seem to be okay in some way, accepted or was made harder to be doing the right things. All right, so that's very troubling and very dark, but we are learning, and that's where the urgency comes in. There was a study in JAMA that came out this year that found a decline in adverse event rates across the board nationally over the 10-year period right before the pandemic. So unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, pandemic kind of might have reversed this. But during that 10-year period, starting about 2010, we have seen across the board, and this is a very large study, one of the largest that's been done on patient safety, and I've never been able to report anything like this, ever. I've been in patient safety for a long time. I've never been able to say, progress, not even small studies. It's hard to find any progress. We had progress, finally, in the last 10 years. We're not there yet, but we had some progress. What does that mean? What happened in the past decade that was different from prior decades when we also really worked hard? Everyone in this room I know has been working hard on this issue. And we really wanted to change patient safety for a long, long time. Leapfrog started in 2000. We were trying to solve it then. What happened in 2010 to 2019 that changed? Suddenly we got a little progress. What happened? Well, here's the one thing that was different about the past decade: transparency. For the first time, as a result of the Affordable Care Act, we had widespread public reporting of hospital performance on patient safety by hospital. When that happened, CMS started reporting it, and as you know, Leapfrog took that and made it into the safety grade to focus on patient safety, and we're proud of the fact that that has gotten a lot of attention. So between CMS and what Leapfrog did with patient safety and what others have done with transparency in general, over the past decade, we have seen real progress. Transparency doesn't do it. Transparency I like to think of as the ignition on the car. It gets the car started. You got to start the car, and then everyone else drives it. The leaders in healthcare drive that car. But we got to get it started. We can't do this without transparency. We can't hide information. We have to make it public, even when it hurts, even when it's hard. In fact, especially when it's hard. Because transparency is what will change things. It's the critical, indispensable first thing. So we also found, in looking at data in the safety grade, there was an improvement over the past 10 years. And we've seen it from other things that Leapfrog measures. For instance, in the hospital survey, we ask about early elective deliveries scheduled without a medical reason prior to 40 weeks. And what we find is a pattern of major improvement. Now, this is because healthcare leaders stepped up and were amazing. And there was incredible work by many of you in this room to change so that we stopped doing early elective deliveries. They cause millions of visits to NICUs that are unnecessary. But what really moved that ignition was when Leapfrog started publicly reporting this in 2010. When the measure came out, we started reporting it for the first time in 2010. And after 2 decades by ACOG and March of Dimes to try to make these deliveries stop, and after all that, what really got that going and momentum was when Leapfrog reported by hospital. Because it's one thing to say, oh, we're against early elective deliveries and we don't do them, or we're really working hard to stop them. It's another thing to say, wow, we have a 40% rate and the hospital down the street has a 20% rate. What are we doing? It just changes the dynamic to know how everyone's doing, even within the hospital that didn't even know they had high rates in some cases. Transparency is that first ignition. It's not going to do the job. You, the leaders, do that job. But this is the essential first step to change. So, the path forward. National Patient Safety Foundation had a a steering committee that I was pleased to be part of that came to the conclusion if transparency were a drug, it would be a blockbuster. It starts there. And ethics, according to Albert Schweitzer, is nothing else than reverence for life. We must have reverence for life, and to me, and I hope to you, that is urgent. Thank you.